now entering the Horror Sanctum.
Hello and welcome back to the Horror Sanctum podcast. I'm Jay with John, Kellen, and TJ. And this week we're going to talk about one of my favorite 90s horror films and quite possibly one of my favorite top 10 horror films of all time. 1998's The Faculty, directed by Robert Rodriguez. I absolutely adore this movie. How do you know this? Well, here's the movie. Here's the vinyl. But wait. Here's the shirt with the cast. Like I've loved this movie from the jump. So if you're not familiar with it, basically aliens have invaded small town Ohio, and they're starting to take over everyone, take over the school. But they're starting with the faculty.
That is correct, because you gotta get the buy-in really from the top down, and you gotta get the principals and the teachers to. It's really an allegory for how society breaks down. It breaks down and it rots from the head down, right? Kind of like our government and stuff at times. So I've only seen this movie probably 3 or 4 times over the years. I hadn't seen it in a long time, but I randomly watched it on one of the streaming channels sometime in the last year, and then I rewatched it a couple days ago, and every time I watch it, I like it. I mean, it really encapsulates that late 90s horror resurgence that was happening at post-Scream. This was 1998, so kind of right dead in the middle of kind of that late 90s horror renaissance. This film had an interesting history because on all measurable metrics, it was a success. $15 million budget. Grossed domestically a little over 40 million in the US. It released on Christmas Day 1998, which you wouldn't typically think would be a good release date for a sci-fi horror film, but they put in some young hot actors that were hot on all the metrics.
It's about like releasing The Haunted Mansion in late July.
Yeah. Yeah,
just doesn't make that much
fired.
sense.
Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Yeah, so I honestly thought I had the perception until I looked up the numbers that this film was kind of like a low-key, wasn't a big theatrical success and become kind of a cult film in years later, because I didn't watch it when it initially come out until a while after. It was kind of one of those that kind of got lost in the mix for me, like the Relic and the Mimic, and there were lots of the somethings that there was 2-word horror titles in the late 90s that all just kind of run together to me. I think this was only Josh Hartnett's second film after Halloween H2O, which was his debut film. This was a big debut film for a lot of people, including
another heartthrob getting his start in horror.
Exactly. And Usher, a heartthrob to many generations of music adoring fans. This was his film debut. Also, Jordana Brewster's film debut, who would go on 3 years later to start starring with Vin Diesel, Paul Walker, and I think she's in all the Fast and the Furious movies, pretty much. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of her claim to fame. But Clea Duvall, I love Clea Duvall and everything I see her in. And the 2003 film Identity, she is a standout in that.
She's fabulous. I had like the biggest crush on her. Me and Vito were just talking about the faculty and talking about her and how we're not her type, obviously. But,
oddly enough,
that goth girl, it got me.
Yeah, she is actually a lesbian. In this film, playing a heterosexual, pretending to be a lesbian, so people will leave her alone. I only recently found that out because she does play the kind of goth, kind of offbeat girl in a lot of things, especially in that era. obviously she did it well. Lots of random, just random things about this film. For one, it's directed by the great genre director Robert Rodriguez, and this is kind of early into his career. They come out with El Mariachi, a self-produced film he only made for like $8,000. He wrote a book about it called Rebel Without a Crew, which I still think is the seminal, one of the best, if not the best, movies on independent filmmaking, other than Lloyd Kaufman's How to Make Your Own Damn Movie. One of the best out there for anybody that wants to make a creative genre film on a budget. I mean, he actually, him and one of his friends did medical testing, I think in Mexico, like a 30-day medicine trial that made them all sick just because they got paid some money for the trials. So, I mean, they were invested, and they were just trying to make a film to produce for the Mexican direct-to-video market in the early 90s. That was a thing, to just try and make its money back. And had no idea it would, do what it did on the festival circuit. And so that took off. He kind of did a semi-sequel remake with Antonio Banderas and Desperado in 95. Right before that, I did a direct-to-TV thing in 94, an early David Arquette film called Road Racers that he actually wrote with one of his college buddies. So he had only really made, and then 2 years before this in 96, maybe my favorite Robert Rodriguez film, that also stars his then friend Quentin Tarantino, From Dusk Till Dawn. Great genre film. I hope we cover it on the show at some point. It's just a super fun
I used
movie.
to own that movie on a PSP.
A PSP.
That's
Wow.
a dated reference.
That is
That's
dated.
so random. That's so random.
But it's a good movie if they made it on a PSP UMD disc, because they only made hit movies or movies that young people would actually want to watch on those things. So it has an audience. So he'd only had like 2.5 feature films under his belt, depending on how you count them. 3 if you count El Mariachi, that was super low budget and totally self-produced. When this come out in 98, at that point he already had a relationship, I believe, with the Weinsteins and Miramax, that's obviously how he met Quentin, who was already hooked up with those guys, and did all their early films with their studio. But it's basically an updated take on Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is actually Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which I'm glad that they point this out in the script, in the film. One of the characters, I think it's Clea Duvall's character, actually becomes the nerd by default who happens to know about books and movies and stuff, says that, well, actually, Invasion of the Body Snatchers was just a remake of The Puppet Masters, which was a Robert Heinlein. It was actually just short stories that got compiled in sci-fi magazines, but then later was compiled into a book in 1951. And has since become a seminal sci-fi novel, Robert Heinlein, which was later made into a film in 1994. So 4 years before this, starring Donald Sutherland. That's a low-key, pretty good sci-fi horror film. A good take on the, which is also kind of a wink to the 1978 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, because Donald Sutherland was the male lead of that film too. And most people consider the 78 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers to be superior to the 1950s one, even though the 1950s one has a soft spot in my heart, at least. Anyway, lots to be said about this film. The CGI, I think, is the only thing that's a little bit dated. I give it a pass. You don't expect that thing to jump out of the pool the way it does, looking kind of like a weird shellfish, almost like from the movie Aliens, xenomorph shellfish swimmy thing, but then randomly turns into, Southern speaking naked chick. Yeah, that's a little strange, but I'm here for it. And there's just so many good scenes, like the classic scene with Josh Hartnett, and the first scene I remember somebody really taking a paper cutter. Megan has since brought it back and really doing some damage with it. This is a much more satisfying scene, cutting off Jon Stewart from the Daily Show's fingers and then revealing that he's one of the monster things. Just so many cool scenes in this movie. I think it's definitely for people of a certain age, which we all are. It's definitely hits you in all the late 90s feels. I mean, I was a freshman in high school when this movie come out, so I know all the references. I know the styles of the clothes, all the things. It just kind of hits you in the feels. The soundtrack is great. I think I heard some Creed in there, like you hear in all the late 90s.
Damn right you did. Damn right.
Like you hear in all the late 90s. This is a Kevin Williamson, the creator of the Scream universe, and wrote the first screenplay. I think did the story to the second Scream. This is early in his powers and his career really coming along in the horror genre. It's got all the things. Robert Rodriguez does a great job directing. It's a great cast. Actually, on the set of this film, Harry Knowles from Ain't It Cool News, back when he was still cool, actually was visiting the set because he's a friend of Robert Rodriguez and is an Austin guy. And he was the one on this set that convinced Elijah Wood to read Lord of the Rings and go audition for Peter Jackson, who was just starting to do auditions for New Line. So
nice. He played a teacher too, right? He's in the teacher's lounge at one point.
Yeah, I think he is.
Yeah.
I think he is. And another cool thing about the teachers, there's so many references in this because Robert Rodriguez, similar to Quentin Tarantino, is a super nerdy, film geek like we are. And Jon Stewart's character is actually named Edward Furlong, who is the actor who plays John Carter in Terminator 2. And Robert Patrick, who's most famous as the T-1000 in Terminator 2, is the gym coach, football coach in this film. So that was kind of a wink and a nod to some other early 90s stuff going on. Man, I'm a big fan of this film. I could keep talking about it, even though I haven't seen as much as I know Jay has. Jay's a big fan. So yeah, I'll pass off to the next person. We'll pick it up.
The Faculty. Let's see. Oh, what a piece of shit. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
You got me.
I'm just
You
kidding.
got me.
If this is true, and you're listening to this right now, we are currently looking for our fourth co-host.
I just fired myself. No. I like this movie a lot. I remember watching it. It was probably close to opening weekend in the 90s. I remember watching it in the theater. It's got all the vibes of the 90s, like TJ, like you were saying. It's Kevin Williamson. It's got Marco Beltrami doing the score. So it feels like Scream. It feels like a lot of those 90s movies. You can kind of do like a double feature and, or H2O, right? Because Josh Hartnett's in H2O. Josh Hartnett's in this movie. So there's a lot of feels of the 90s and nostalgia with it. I had not seen it in a long time. What I was really blown away by watching it again was just the cast. There's so many actors in this movie. You could split the cast in half, and this movie would be filled with actors that you know. And it's like Robert Patrick, Famke Janssen, Jon Stewart, Elijah Wood. There's so many people. Selma Hayek, even in just small roles, like just really Piper Laurie, who is a
Fraser Crane's wife.
Yeah. I just Harry Knowles, which I recognize him immediately. A lot of cool cameos, a lot of cool actors in it. I did like the homage to, it's kind of like a modern, basically, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. I really like the idea of the drug sort of drying out the alien's body. And I didn't know this, back then. I wasn't thinking about this, but watching it today, when I saw them doing the test, I was like, oh, it's the homage to The Thing.
It is John Carpenter's 1982 Thing.
And I didn't pick up on that back in the day, but I think I just didn't notice it as much. And I know that Robert Rodriguez is a big Carpenter fan. He did Planet Terror. And I know I was watching behind the scenes of that one time, and him and Quentin Tarantino were talking about how, in his mind, Planet Terror was like the Carpenter movie that didn't get made, that was somehow in the early 80s that he just didn't make, which I could see that. But yeah, this movie's a lot of fun. You kind of just have to have fun with this, right? You really can't pick it apart. Yeah, the CGI is kind of hokey in parts, like when Famke Janssen's head's
That's the best
going,
part.
you know. I mean, it's silly, but I will say the creature design is kind of cool. I mean, at the end, it's like a parasite, so it looks very interesting. Looks like a parasitic creature. I really liked how they subverted the characters in the movie. You know, all of the characters had an arc, right? All of, like, the jock wanted to be better, the smart kid wanted to be popular, you know, everybody kind of went against their type in a way. And I like that Elijah Wood's character is kind of the savior at the end of the movie. Like, you kind of think watching the movie that it's going to be Josh Hartnett, right? Because he's the cool guy. His character is kind of ridiculous. Like, he's smart, he's good looking, he's always got the answers. He somehow knows, like, philosophy and chemistry, but yet he looks like a GQ model. I mean, it is right. That's just how they wrote these characters.
That don't exist in reality.
No, but I did like how he was kind of the side character as the movie went along. I thought that was pretty clever. And I think this movie doesn't really get a lot of credit for those type of choices, because they really went again. They could have gone a little more formulaic. And I think the fact that they didn't was kind of cool. I think it just shows that Robert Rodriguez was trying to do some different things here. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many times I'm going to rewatch it in the future. It's one of those movies that I feel like it's such a interesting place in the 90s, and it kind of hits all the nostalgia feels. I kind of like just not watching it often, because then it's always kind of a refresher for me. Like, even today, there was just a lot of things I had totally forgotten about in the movie. And it is a pretty movie to watch. I mean, it's one of those movies that, like, it's perfect for, like, the fall and October. It's got that, like, Halloween type vibe to it, even though it's not a Halloween movie. So, yeah,
It was great overall, for a Christmas Day release.
Right. That's the weirdest thing. Like, that's the only thing, thinking about that release date. I don't really know what, I guess that was probably just all they could do, right, for the release date. But didn't seem to make a lot of sense for them to do that, but I understand, you know, probably is just what they had. But this is definitely the Robert Rodriguez I prefer. This Planet Terror, From Dusk Till Dawn. I know that his career's kind of gone all over the place. He kind of got caught up in the whole Spy Kids thing. I don't know what that's about, but, you know, I wish he would go back to these roots of, like, horror and, like, suspense thriller. Like, I really
Sin City, which also he brought back Josh Hartnett and Elijah Wood for. Yeah,
that's a great one too. That's probably one of his better ones. But overall, yeah, I really can't say a lot of bad things about The Faculty. I think most of the movie, you know, you have to go along for the ride. You know, Kevin Williamson's dialogue, you either love it or hate it. I like it. It's charming to me. It's just it's like a warm feeling whenever I hear his dialogue. So yeah, overall,
I agree with that completely, because one of the things that really turned me off about movies is the dialogue. Like, you can have bad dialogue and ruin a perfectly good movie. But even though I've watched The Faculty 50 times, the dialogue never bothers me, besides the couple fighting, John Abrams or whatever his name is, and the girlfriend. Like, that's a little much for me, but overall, I think the dialogue's spot on for that time, which we were all, you know, products of.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, overall, yeah, I mean, I really like it. I think the only thing, aside from the CGI, that is confusing, because I was thinking about it today, is the teachers that died and stayed dead. I wasn't sure, because I couldn't tell who was alive, and I guess it really didn't matter at the end of the movie, but I was kind of wondering, like, I wonder who lived and who was dead, you know? But overall, yeah, great movie for sure.
Yeah. And I agree. And for those who follow the show, this will come as no surprise. I watched it for the first time a week ago. So, so, you know, batting 1,000 on being the noob, but was pleasantly surprised. And it's not that it wasn't one of those movies that I just didn't watch because I thought it would be bad. I just never got around to it. You know, it was late 90s, early 2000s. You know, this movie came out in 98. So that time frame, I was more into comedies. I would actually go to Walmart late at night, early 2000s, probably 2002. I lived right beside Walmart within walking distance in my apartment. So I'd walk over to Walmart and I would just buy a DVD based on the cover. So, go in, look at the 750 movies, find one that looked interesting and go watch it. And so I watched a lot of comedies, missed out on a lot of the 90s horror films. But this pleasantly surprised, and it's a product of its time, but it still holds up. I know we've talked about that before. You have a movie that's a product of its time. It doesn't quite hold up to today's standards, but this movie's put together so well for a late 90s movie that it doesn't feel like a late 90s movie. You forget the some of the cheesy dialogue. That's any kind of teen movie is going to have that. You forget the CGI because, the Matrix original trilogy was so groundbreaking, but if you watch it now, the CGI with the Smith fight and Neo flying off throughout the movie just looks so bad by today's standards. You look at Marvel movies and some of the action films now, and the CGI is incredible, and then you look at that and you're like, no, that looks like somebody took a G.I. Joe doll and dressed it like Neo and threw it across the screen for the shot. It looks bad. So I can forgive those because I realized that the time, what they had to work with, that's the best they could do. And they did a good job. Talking about the cast, talk about an all-star cast of young talent and then some older. You have Josh Hartnett, Elijah Wood, Jordana Brewster, Clea Duvall, Usher, Selma Hayek, Famke Janssen, Robert Patrick, Jon Stewart, Bebe Neuwirth, just to name a few. And all of their roles are meaningful. It's hard to get that many big names together in a film. They weren't necessarily big names at that time. Like you said, several of them, this was their film debut. But to get that many rising stars or young stars together and have their roles play a part other than just to be there. So they did a really good job of balancing such a unique cast. And y'all said that it's, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, kind of a remake of that. I would argue this is the horror version of The Breakfast Club. Because when you look at the motley crew that they get together, they all fit almost identical to some of the people that were in The Breakfast Club.
That's true.
You had your social outcast, you had the popular girl, you had the jock, you had the nerdy guy. It's like they took the model of The Breakfast Club and said, what if we turned that into a motley crew of, teenagers that are fighting off their teachers that have been possessed by aliens. So, and I was like, it's such a cool concept to take, something so familiar and then completely turn it on its head.
I will interrupt you for a second. If you look at the shirt, what does it look like to you? How they're sitting and everything? It's very
looks like Party of
clubbing.
Five.
It's very
Breakfast
well
Club
that
too.
too.
Yeah, they knew what they were doing.
It does look like kind of like the cover of Breakfast Club. And this is just a fun aside because it was the weirdest coincidence. So in the movie, the ending of the movie, Elijah Wood sees the bleachers. He runs through the back of them and hits the button. He's trying to beat them from crushing him. Probably 3 days before watching this movie, I was watching an episode of The X-Files that was about witches. And if you're familiar with that episode, there's a scene in it where one of the two girls that are witches mess with the electronics and they use the bleachers to crush a kid in the same way that they crush the monster. So I was like, that is such a weird coincidence that I'm watching a movie where bleachers end up closing and crushing somebody. And then I watched The X-Files a couple of days before and the exact same thing happens. Granted that, there was no hanging out at the end, like he was fully crushed, but it was just such a weird coincidence that within the span of a couple of days, I see the same thing happen in a TV show and then in a movie. So as far as the movie, like John said, you could pick it apart, but why would you? It's just such a fun ride. The soundtrack is incredible. Some great songs, and the cover of Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 by Class of 99 is fantastic. I actually bought about 2 years ago a vinyl and it's all remakes of Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall album. And that's on there. And that was the first time that I heard that. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. Then you watch the movie and I was like, that's a perfect, whoever came up with the music, the Kids Aren't All Right by The Offspring being in there as well.
We're both versions of Another Brick in the Wall on that CD. So they did an instrumental version of it as well, which is
just
what
the
you
one
hear in the beginning.
No, just the one that people are probably most familiar with. Okay. But you can tell that there was a lot of care that went into this movie. You know, it's not a big budget film. It doesn't have to be. The acting's great. Storyline is great. Of course, it's familiar, so it plays well. But just every part of this movie is so 90s, but it's so fun. And it's such an enjoyable film to sit through. You know, sometimes I find myself pulling up my phone while I'm watching something because I get kind of bored, and at no point did I stop watching the screen because it was just fun. And it, like we mentioned it just about every episode, pacing in this movie is great. It's a good complete 90s movie. So I mean, that's all I know how to say. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. It's definitely a movie I'll watch again and won't be upset about it.
It had a lot of action too. Like it was very much an action movie as well as just a horror movie, and the comedy was there. Obviously, I have a soft spot for this. You guys already know that. If you ask me, you know, name 10 horror movies I should watch before I die, The Faculty is going to be on there. I would probably watch that over Rosemary's Baby and other classics that are essentially better films, but to me, they're not. This one holds a special place for me. I saw it in theaters. I've probably seen it 25 plus times. I've listened to the soundtrack repeatedly. To touch on the soundtrack a little bit, when 90s had great soundtracks, early 2000s did too. That's stopped since for the most part, but back then it was just all rock. So like, here's some of the artists on the Faculty soundtrack if you're not familiar with it. So Class of 99, which Kellen spoke of, that's Lane Staley from Alice in Chains, Tom Morello, Rage Against the Machine, and then a couple people from Jane's Addiction and Porno for Pyros. That's a stud lineup right there. The Offspring, the best band on the planet, Creed, they're on there covering Alice Cooper's I'm 18. Soul Asylum, Garbage, Stabbing Westward. One of my favorite songs of all time is Haunting Me by Stabbing Westward, which is on this soundtrack. Oasis, Sheryl Crow, Sean Mullins. I mean, it's a stacked cast. It's a stacked soundtrack. So they definitely knew what they were doing. And to me, that helps make it more memorable and give it that spot in my heart, because I don't only have a great movie to watch, which I probably watch once a year, but I have a great soundtrack I can listen to all the time. And like that makes a difference.
Is Rockabye on the soundtrack?
It's not Rockabye. He covered Changes by David Bowie.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so
Changes.
There were a few covers on there, but great soundtrack. And I don't know if I could really pick up on what everybody said. Like, if anybody, I would seriously kick you off if you hated this movie, John or Kellen or anybody else, because this movie's fantastic. And like Kellen said, like, it doesn't always have to be smart. It doesn't always have to be elevated horror, but something that's fun. That's what we're missing in a lot of movies today. Like when we did the Megan episode, a lot of the Megan stuff was fun. The chase scenes were fun. This is another one where it's fun. Josh Hartnett.
He didn't slip there.
Who is the only actor in Hollywood who doesn't ever have to fix his hair?
No,
and
his hair
always looks like he just woke up and went to the set.
When this movie came out, I tried to do my hair that way, but for a fat kid, it doesn't work as well. Obviously, I also tried to wear long sleeve shirts underneath my t-shirts. Also, as a fat kid, that doesn't work well because you're fat and get hot. But I idolized him from this movie and H2O and like everything I love Josh Hartnett. Like I would take a bullet for that man. I can't explain it, but I would.
I still sometimes rock the long sleeves under the t-shirts in the wintertime.
Yeah, but see, you're not a chunky boy like this one. So,
well.
But it's just fun. It's rewatchable. I think, we graduated in, we're aging ourselves, but some of us graduated in 2002. So we're very close to this movie age-wise, and we connected with that too. If you ask me which one I would watch more between that and Scream, I would pick The Faculty. And I know that's blasphemous. I know it is, but I would. And it's just the music and everything. Like, and this one with Scream, there's still that element of surprise. And like the ending where the killers are revealed in Scream is still top 10, fantastic. Like it's great. But I can't explain why, but I just, we all have that one movie that we have a soft spot for, and this one is it for me, 110%. So, pretty unanimous. But let's go around to our kills and we'll do our ratings. I'm going to spoiler alert for mine. It's going to be 5. So, I'll go first with kills. Jon Stewart, because that paper cutter scene is one of the most iconic things I've ever seen in my life. When I saw that, I'm like, oh shit. Like, I was stoked. I'm like, do it. And even though, he slices his fingers, it's not necessarily the kill, it's the pen with the drug that Josh is peddling. But I just love that whole scene, not necessarily just for the kill, but for the lead up to the kill. So that would be mine.
But then the fingers come to life and become parasites to try and go get the other kids.
Right. TJ?
Man, I think my favorite scene or my favorite kill would be when the 4 football players early in the movie kill Elijah Wood's nuts against the flagpole out in front, because that looks so brutal.
I felt that in my V-hole.
Yes.
Yeah,
and even when he becomes popular, apparently that's just a thing that the jocks do there, because they show it at the end being done to another kid.
Yeah. It's a rite of passage, I guess. So I mean, that's the one that gives me the wince more than any actual kill. Although I have to imagine he lost at least one man down of those nuts to multiple flagpole traumas.
All right, Johnny.
I just can't think of the kills, really. It's hard to I don't know. I would probably say Jon Stewart. That's the one that comes to mind. I know the teacher at the beginning, she kind of dies and then she comes back. But it's almost, I thought they killed her at first, because like when Piper Laurie stabs her, I was like, oh, they're just gonna kill her. But then she got turned. So I was a little confused by that. But
yeah, it's a little hard to know who actually dies and who doesn't.
I'm assuming, I mean, if I'm wrong, do people come back after at the end? Like, they come back to their normal selves?
Yes.
Only if they didn't do the melty thing. If they did the melty thing, they're
gone. And I think
I would assume that the parasites take over that body, but I imagine that if you get stabbed, your body dies, but that parasite then picks it up. That's what I like to think. Is if you really died, like got your head cut off and became a little squiddy, you probably died.
But they had the healing power. That's how Famke Janssen was able to come back later. She gets her head cut off, but then the head reassembles. Bebe Neuwirth, she gets stabbed out inside the front door of the school, and then she comes back until she's ultimately killed by the
I would say that
the drug.
So the alien can resurrect, can heal themselves, but the people can't. So if they're already infected, they can heal themselves. But I imagine if you're stabbed to death, just in my mind, you're stabbed to death, you're dead, and then they just take over your body like a puppet.
Well, Famke Janssen, even though she lost her head, she was in the stands for Josh Hartnett after he joined the football team.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, and the Bebe Neuwirth one.
Which one is she?
Stabbed. She was Fraser Crane's wife, Lily.
Yeah, the first one got stabbed. Yeah.
So she got stabbed. So you could, and then she's one of the ones that actually died. That was my favorite death. Just by the way, it was just so gruesome. Her dying in the gym, face basically melting. But we don't see Jon Stewart come back, and he was killed by the drug. Yeah. Obviously, the head. The head alien, she doesn't come back because she was killed with the drug. So it seems to follow that regardless of what happened to you, once the alien takes you over, they have the healing ability, so you're still alive once the alien dies.
Yeah, because Robert Patrick had claws. On like the first day, but then it healed. The more water they drank, the more they had like healing abilities.
The grossest death, though, Bebe Neuwirth's probably the one that stands out the most because it's such a visual death. The grossest one was the old teacher.
Oh yeah, with pulling the hair out.
Yeah. Oh god. Yeah. She
had to get naked first too.
That was hard to. I was like, oh, that was the scene that maybe in future viewings I might look at my phone for about 2 minutes.
We'll get Robert Rodriguez, Josh Hartnett, Usher all on the show to see what they think about who died and who didn't. All right. So star rating out of 5. I've already told you I'm going to go 5. TJ.
Man, I don't have the nostalgia for it that Jay has, but I did watch it relatively in its era, and I've watched it more recently a couple of times. I'm on the fence between 3.5 and 4. I'm gonna go 3.5 just because I don't have the same nostalgia for it. But still
Fair.
solid. Still solid.
Yeah. John?
Yeah, I'm the same. I really like it a lot. I did have nostalgia. I don't love it. It doesn't hit me as much as like Scream and stuff, but I think it's really solid.
Yeah, I had nostalgia for the era, but not for the
Right.
film itself. That's the difference for me.
Yeah, I would say realistically 3.5. Yeah, it's a very solid movie though. I'd recommend it.
Kellen?
Yeah, I'm gonna stick with everybody else. We're gonna have a 4.25 as an overall rating because of Jay's grade giving a swing on the bell curve, but at 3.5 is I think perfectly fair. It's just a fun film. It's complete. It's got rewatchability. Is it in the upper echelon of horror films? No. Is it one of those ones that you could pop in, with some friends that you would recommend to other people? Oh, you got to see this. Yeah, absolutely. So I think 3.5.
Yeah, and that's fair. And like I said, I have a soft spot for it, and we are going to have those movies where you like them a little bit better than everybody else does, and that's fair. So that's what 4. We'll call it a 4 out of 5 because of me. You're welcome, Josh. All right, so that's gonna do it for this episode. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast now. We would greatly appreciate it. And come over to Facebook. We have a group called the Church Horror Sanctum, where we talk about horror. We share videos, upcoming flicks, and have good conversations. So come do that too. We'd love to have you. All right. So for John, Kellen, TJ, I'm Jay. And until next time,
Keep it spooky.